Hello.
Hello, please.
Yeah, what's the problem, sir?
We just drove down our farm track.
Yeah.
Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it.
Yeah.
It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And in this video, we hear from other inmates on the Witness Protection Unit who spent a great deal of time in the company of Darren Nicholls. These men tell a very different story regarding the evening of December the 6th, 1995, and the evidence which was provided by Darren Nicholls which ultimately convicted Michael Steele and Jack Womes of triple murder. I first met Darren Nicholls on the 24th of October 1996 when he was introduced into the Witness Protection Scheme. When a new person joins the scheme, there is a natural interest by other members of the unit to find out who they are and the reason for their involvement in the scheme. Darren Nicholls was no exception. He readily spoke to members of the unit about his involvement in the Rettendon Range Rover murders. The murders had been the subject of extensive publicity in the national press, and I was certainly aware that they had been committed. Darren was only on the Protected Witness Unit for a few days before he was returned to police custody. During this period, I recall that he was in general conversation with the inmates on the unit. He told them while he had no prior knowledge of or involvement in the murders, he had taken 2 men in his car to the murder scene. 4 men arrived at the scene in the Range Rover, and after the murders had been committed, Darren took 3 men from the scene in his car. When he told his version of events, which was on an almost daily basis, he always laboured the point that he had no prior knowledge that the men were going to be shot. I formed the impression that he did know, and he was lying. This impression was just my gut feeling based on the amount of times he kept denying his involvement over and over again. As I mentioned, Darren left the unit after a few days, but I next met him when the unit was transferred in November 1996. He rejoined us there, but again he only stayed for a relatively short period of time. He again spent the majority of his subsequent period of detention at that prison in police custody. Darren's story concerning the murders had changed dramatically. I recall overhearing Darren engaged in a conversation with the inmates on one occasion. He was talking about the murders, and although I wasn't directly involved in the conversation, I was listening to him and heard what he said. On this occasion, he said that he had taken 2 men to the scene in his car, and another 3 men had arrived in the Range Rover. He never said who had travelled in which vehicle, whether it was the gunman or the deceased. I noticed the number of people in each account did not tally up. Darren also said that he knew everybody's movements because they had traced their mobile phones to various transmitters or relay stations. I asked Darren if they could get an accurate triangulation fix on a mobile phone, but he just gave me a blank look. From that I took it meant he didn't understand the technicalities of police methods, or that his statement had to fit the mobile phone evidence. Darren said that the police had said it was important the transmitter evidence and his own evidence matched. From my own experience, I know that if any discrepancies arise when you are making your statement, the police stop the interview and an off-the-record discussion takes place regarding your discrepancy. I know Darren had several such tea breaks, but I have no idea what was discussed between him and his police handlers. I have no clear recollection as to exactly how I became aware of this because it was such a long time ago, but I can only presume it was because Darren had told me at some point. On one occasion, while Darren and I were in the unit, we held a conversation. This conversation took place in my cell as Darren asked my opinion on a matter associated with charges against him. He told me that he had been charged with involvement in the importation of cannabis, but the police had suggested that he admitted involvement in Class A drugs. Their logic was that if Darren admitted more serious offences, his credibility when he gave evidence would be higher in the eyes of the jury, but he would not be subject to a more severe sentence when sentenced by the judge. I told Darren that such a proposition did not make much sense to me. While it was necessary that he did admit all that he had been involved in, otherwise the defence may be able to challenge his honesty when he gave evidence, there was no reason for him to admit to things he hadn't done. I also have a recollection during this conversation that Darren indicated in a roundabout way that his operational police wanted him to bend the truth during his evidence. My recollection is that the police wanted him to say that he had continued to import drugs with Steele and Womes after the murders had taken place, whereas I can remember Darren specifically telling me that he had nothing more to do with the 2 of them after the murders. I also have a recollection that there was an exhibit in the case that was a shotgun. Darren was told by the police to say that the shotgun had been obtained before the murders, where Darren assured me that it was actually obtained after the murders. I told Darren that I didn't want to know about such things, and that if he told lies, he had to be careful not to be caught out. That is a very shortened version of a conversation that actually took place over around 20 minutes. However, after all this time, that is all I can remember. Darren gave me the impression that the police had put certain pressures on him to admit to things that he hadn't done, and to give false evidence. Darren explained that the police had made promises and virtually waved a blank cheque in his face. He said that he wanted a new identity being offered, and a fresh start, and if that meant admitting to offences he hadn't committed and committing perjury, then that is what he was willing to do. I have no idea if Darren Nicholls did give false evidence at the trial of Mr. Steele and Mr. Womes. All I know is that he said he intended to do so. These are the only conversations I can recall with Darren Nicholls concerning his evidence or accounts of the murder, but he did frequently talk about his role as a supergrass and appeared almost boastful that he was the top supergrass on the witness protection unit. Hearing Darren talk about how he was going to stand in the witness box and tell a story I knew wasn't true, and possibly pleading guilty to extra charges that were to add credibility to what amounted to a pack of lies, I just wanted to walk away. I chose to ignore what Darren had told me, as I felt the accused would have their day in court. The evidence of a supergrass would be backed up with forensic evidence, and a whole plethora of other evidence and additional witnesses. I felt it wasn't my problem. It was down to the defence barristers. It was their job to refute Darren Nicholls' lies, and it would be the judge and jury's job to see that justice was done. I have been asked if I would describe myself as a father figure whilst I was in the witness protection unit. I would not call myself a father figure, but I was one of the more mature, stable and sensible prisoners. Because of this, I was often told things in confidence. In general, I kept those conversations confidential. Occasionally they were about others on the unit, but mostly they were about personal or private matters where my advice was being sought. During my time on both units, I saw approximately 47 prisoners pass through the system, and I taught a lot of them how to use the computer. I can confirm that I spent some time teaching Darren how to use the computer. I saw Darren producing letters to his solicitors, but I didn't see him producing anything about his case, detention or circumstances. I subsequently heard reference to the trial of Mr. Steele and Mr. Womes on the news, and I knew it was also being reported on in the press, but I didn't follow it closely. It was only after I read reports in the Daily Mail newspaper article in 1999, which were written by Joanne Goodwin, that I realised that there was no other corroborating evidence, and the evidence of Darren Nicholls was the only evidence which convicted Steele and Womes. On the 5th of August 1999, I saw a television programme called Inside Story, which covered the same ground as the newspaper article. At this stage, I was still in prison, and it was not practical to attempt to contact defence lawyers, as I was concerned that I would be identified in the prison system and at the protected witness unit as a troublemaker. It was of course against all prison rules to have contact in any way with the media. All telephone calls were recorded, and my mail would have been read by the prison staff. I also felt that if I had spoken out against a fellow supergrass and the police, there was a possibility that it could affect my relationship with my witness protection officers and my status on the witness protection scheme. I was subsequently contacted by the Criminal Cases Review Commission, whom interviewed me regarding my dealings with Darren Nicholls. I made 3 statements to them, one dated the 20th of June 2002 and 2 dated the 25th of September. One of them, dated the 25th of September, simply authorised the Daily Mail newspaper to release any relevant records or information to the CCRC. I can confirm that at no time have I received any payment from Joanne or her newspaper. On the first occasion I met her, she bought me lunch, and on the second occasion I bought her lunch. I have not been offered any payment or financial reward. I told Joanne of my information, and since that time she has kept in contact with me. She has written 2 newspaper articles concerning my criminal background and the involvement in the manufacture of drugs. I have also been asked if I have any knowledge of Darren Nicholls being in contact with members of the media whilst he was in custody. I can confirm that I am not aware of Darren having any contact with any journalists while he was in the protected witness unit. Darren did not say to me about having any contact with the media whilst he was on the unit. However, I am aware that other prisoners were visited by journalists whilst on the witness protection scheme. The following statement is dated the 22nd of August 2003. At the end of October, early November 1996, I was on the protected witness unit. A day or so after my arrival, I recall Darren Nicholls returned to the unit, having been out with his police handlers. I think there were around 8 of us prisoners on the unit at that time. I remember meeting Darren on the day he returned, and we chatted for some time where he quickly told me that his case was to do with the Range Rover killings in Essex. Darren also told me that before the killing he was a police informant, and that the police officer he had been working with in Essex had been nicked soon after. I cannot remember the name of the police officer Darren was working with, but I recall Darren saying he was nicked for drugs. Darren and I became fairly close at the witness protection unit, and we often discussed our cases with each other. Darren started to open up to me about his case. I remember particularly sometime around Christmas 1996, we were in the exercise yard, and Darren was talking about his case. I told Darren I'd read about his case, and he told me that he was terrified that either the police wouldn't protect him as they had promised, or that the other guys would get him. He did seem very frightened. I remember Darren telling me that the police had told him that Steele and Womes knew he was an informant. Darren said he had no choice but to go along with the police. I remember Darren telling me it was the police who had concocted the story about Darren's involvement in the Range Rover killings. Darren said that in interviews he was given a script from the police officers. I said to Darren, quote, "What do you mean concocted?" And he told me that the police would slide a piece of paper across the table with what they wanted me to say. Darren told me that some of his answers were read from the sheet of paper given to him by the police. The following statement is dated the 23rd of September 2003. Further to my previous statement that I made on the 22nd of August 2003, I have today been visited by the police. I was shown a copy of a letter addressed to Mike from Jeff. Having read this copy, it is obviously a copy of a letter sent to me by Jeff, a fellow prisoner I mentioned previously from the protected witness unit. Having read the content of the letter, it is obviously referring to the numerous chats Jeff and I had in the computer room at the witness protection unit. These conversations were regarding Darren Nicholls, and myself and Jeff had both come to the conclusion that the 2 men imprisoned for the Rettendon murders were not guilty. We suspected that Essex police may have committed these murders. I have no idea why Jeff thought this, but I certainly believed it because of what Darren had told me about the police passing him notes on what to say had happened. Jeff told me that Darren had admitted to him that he had lied about the case, but would not ever say what areas Darren had lied about. Jeff never told me about the notes passed to Darren by the police, and I never told Jeff what I knew about Darren. It was obvious that Darren had confided in both of us about different areas of his case. Me and Jeff never used to discuss what Darren had told each of us. Well, certainly I didn't tell Jeff about the notes. I had the feeling that Jeff was holding things back from me. I believe Darren opened up to me more than Jeff, perhaps because I was more down to earth than Jeff, who was a very cagey type person and had connections with big people in the criminal world. In relation to the letter, it does appear to be the handwriting of Jeff. I remember Jeff's handwriting from our days in prison together. I remember Jeff's weekly written food forms for food groups. I had been in Jeff's food group on numerous occasions. The following passages come from another inmate on the witness protection unit. We talked many times about his case, and once we became close, he told me that he had made up the story about the shootings to police. He did not say that he had lied to the police, but did say that he had made the story up. My understanding of what he meant by the fact that he had made up the story about the shootings was that he had not told the truth to the police. The following statement comes from another inmate on the witness protection unit, who we will refer to as Inmate A. I remember another protected witness called Darren Nicholls. I remember Darren talking about the fact that he was going to make money by selling his story to the media. I never saw anybody from the media ever visit the protected witness program. Some of the other protected witnesses, such as Jeff, Mike and Damon, used to say that they didn't think that Darren was telling the truth in relation to the Rettendon murders. The 3 of them seemed to be obsessed with discussing Darren's involvement with the job. The following statement comes from an inmate named Inmate R. I got on well with Darren, who spoke freely about his case. I would describe Darren as a bit of a bragger. Darren had a friend who knew someone in the media. Darren told me this when I explained that I was having difficulties with my handlers. Darren was suggesting that I could make money out of my story. I remember Darren at some stage talking about figures of £25,000 for a newspaper story and more for a television documentary. It is difficult to make a judgment on whether Darren was telling the truth in relation to the case. Darren was a storyteller in general, but I do remember that in relation to the murders, Darren explained that he dropped off 2 men for a meeting with their victims. Darren denied knowing what was going to happen. Darren explained he was elsewhere when the murders happened. He told me that he had been sent away for a drink at a pub. But I also remember, I believe he said he was near some farm gates when he heard the sound of gunfire. The other thing to bear in mind was that Darren seemed to tell stories, as I said, but I would guess a lot of the stories he told were to gain esteem on the unit. Darren never at any stage admitted any involvement in the murders other than unwittingly driving the offenders to near the scene. The following is a statement from the 8th of October 2003 from inmate W. I never heard anybody talking about notes being passed to Darren by his police interviewers during those interviews. As I've said before, Jeff, another prisoner on the unit, on many occasions said that Darren was lying in the case he was giving evidence in. Jeff had several conversations with myself, mainly at the time of the trial in which Darren was giving evidence. Also at about the time of the release of Darren's book and television programme. I do remember Jeff specifically saying to me that Darren had confessed to him that he had been coached by the police and told what to say, which was a concoction. Jeff said that when Darren used to leave prison for interviews with police, he used to return and talk about things in relation to his case and show knowledge he didn't previously have, such as talking about the forensic evidence in the case. Jeff also said that Darren's story also changed slightly upon his return. Jeff was trying to say that the police had obviously briefed Darren on his outings. I also remember that Jeff said that Darren was virtually in tears on occasions talking about his fear of giving evidence that the police had told him to give. Jeff was the only other prisoner who told me that he had heard Darren confess to lying about his evidence. Amongst the other prisoners, the general rumour was that Darren was lying, but no one other than Jeff said to me that Darren had confessed to these lies. Okay, right, well, I'll give you a brief overview of my thoughts and feelings quickly, and then I'll probably make a second video which discusses the points in a lot more detail. What I find interesting is the part where it mentions that the police supposedly wanted Nicholls to say that he continued importing with Steele and Wombs after the murders, when in actual reality he had nothing more to do with them. In the Blogs 19 book, if you remember, he keeps in contact with Steele. He's doing work with, work at his house. He's sort of keeping tabs on Steele's importation, his involvement with Tate's brother, etc., etc. But that's certainly an interesting point. It's almost as if the police really want to push forward this narrative of a drug baron who's basically turning against his 2 friends in order to save his skin, which in reality he did. But he's actually caught carrying cannabis. Now, what the police wanted him to say, supposedly, was that he was involved in Class A drugs. He was a massive player in the drug scene, and that would have really given his evidence more sort of credibility in a way. Another interesting point is the amount of people in the Range Rover and the amount of people that Darren Nicholls supposedly took to the crime scene, and this number actually changes, which I find quite interesting. So let's look at the first original supposed words that came out of Darren Nicholls' mouth to the other inmate. Supposedly he said 4 men arrived at the scene in the Range Rover. Well, that would be correct. And after the murders had been committed, Darren took 3 men from the scene. Now, it would be 3 men if it was himself, Wombs and Steele, but if it's 3 men and himself, as in 4 people in total, we're gaining an extra person here. And we're also gaining an extra person when he changes his story sometime later. He goes on to say the following. On this occasion, he said that he had taken 2 men to the scene in his car, and another 3 men had arrived in the Range Rover. Well, we know that this isn't true either, because Michael Steele goes in the Range Rover to the lane, and it's literally just Wombs and Nicholls in the Passat. So that would be 2 people and not 2 separate people, if that makes sense. So we're gaining an extra person on each account made by Darren Nicholls here. I guess what actually lends a lot of credibility to the entire story, and this entire story regarding these protected witnesses, is the fact that we have other inmates who can remember the original inmate's story, saying that he didn't believe Darren Nicholls' version of events. He'd been speaking to him privately. He had admitted that he was basically coached by the police and concocted the entire story. So what we have is someone who's come forward and said, Darren Nicholls has said this to me. He's gone to the extent of, making official statements, contacting the CCRC. Someone who's basically putting himself in potentially a lot of trouble if he's lying, basically. But what he's actually done, he's also told the other inmates whilst he was on the witness protection scheme, he's told them of what he thinks about Darren Nicholls. We have these other people basically backing up this person's thoughts and feelings regarding Darren Nicholls' evidence. Now, obviously, this is a piece which is going to need a second part, and for me to go into more details regarding the finer points as to what is mentioned in this video. But the overall feeling that I get here is that if this guy is telling the truth, and if what he is saying is the truth, that the police are really trying to push forward this drugs narrative. They're trying to get Nicholls to admit to supplying Class A drugs to make his evidence really look a lot more powerful. They're trying to make Nicholls look like a bigger time player than what he perhaps actually was. So was this really the whole narrative the entire time, that the police are pushing this whole drugs deal? They're trying to break the chain of importers. They really desperately want Wombs and Steele banged away for a very long time. Another interesting piece which comes near the end of the video is regarding another inmate which recalls hearing Darren Nicholls saying that he was sent away to a pub to have a drink whilst these killings took place. And then later on he changed his story to say that he was actually standing near some farm gates when he heard the shots go off. So this is incredibly interesting information, certainly worth a deeper dive in a later video. What I find most credible, I guess, overall regarding this is the fact that, as I said earlier, we have one guy who's come forward with a very strong version of events as to what Darren Nicholls told him. And we also have the other inmates which recall this person's views on Darren Nicholls. So we have all of this sort of circumstantial evidence backing up, in a way, what this guy is saying, at least what he thought. It doesn't mean what he is saying is completely true by any means, but it certainly means that he had these thoughts and feelings regarding Nicholls during the time that he was in the witness protection unit.